but we do not act on the basis of that knowledge. And there can be various instances of doing something we really don't consider that was right to be done, but we did it for some self-interest or for something else, or perhaps we failed to perform a supererogatory act we could have performed. So there is a gap between what on a cognitive level we think we ought to do and what on a practical level what we in fact do. So it is not enough, as John Harris, who is not present here, says, to enhance our cognition, in my opinion, because we lack the motivation to act in accordance with that cognition. So that is the problem. Now, the next issue, so Persson Savulescu came to the idea to propose a program of moral bioenhancement because humanity allegedly or truly faces the danger of so-called ultimate harm, so that the conditions on this planet will become unbearable or that the planet will be destroyed. Because our moral capacities have been adapted through evolution to close-knit small societies from the past, we are not up to the task of thinking globally, thinking in terms of the far future, and we are hence not able to avoid ultimate harm. John, I was just ferocious with criticizing, but I was advised to do it in your absence because people told me you're charming and witty, so I will. It will not be good for me if you didn't. So you didn't. In any case, it was not ferocious. In any case, Persson and Savulescu proposed a program I mentioned, and I published in 2014 in the Journal of Medical Ethics an article claiming that their conception of making bioenhancement obligatory would lead to us depriving ourselves of our freedom and thus to some degree of an important element of our human existence, because without being free we can do moral acts, but we don't do them willingly. So we are actually deprived of an essential element of our human existence. So in order to avoid ultimate harm, we actually already inflict a sort of ultimate harm on people by depriving them of their freedom. So we, as I think the expression in English goes, we throw out the baby with the bathwater. So Persson and Savulescu replied in the Journal of Medical Ethics and someone else, Michael Zolopoli, who said that I don't respect the fact that our power to act of our own free will is a matter of degree. But that's not the issue. We can talk about freedom and about free will. And if they had said that freedom is a matter of degree, then I would fully agree with them, because indeed we can have more or less free elections, more or less free media, whatever. But if we talk about our freedom of the will, that is, in my opinion, very much a threshold concept. Because you cannot be deprived by an external mechanism, because the state prescribes that, either by medication or, as Savulescu called, the so-called God machine. So an external mechanism deprives you of a degree of your free will, but part of your free will stays intact. That's, in my opinion, absolutely impossible, because the very moment that an external mechanism takes away a part of your free will, it's not your free will anymore. It's something that has been determined to be your free will by an external mechanism. So that is the essential difference between freedom in the sense I talk about as a political concept or a politics-related concept of freedom, and the free will, which is a threshold concept, and this freedom is not a threshold concept. So, Persson and Savulescu's argument, in my opinion, has not invalidated my stance. So, And that is here what I replies the freedom of the mental common this is the scalar of nature, but freedom of the will is to be understood as a threshold concept and therefore not subject to degree. This is what I just said, with one addition, so that as soon as an external mechanism deprives us of our free will to a certain extent, limitations are being imposed on our freedom to think. And to think what we will, and hence we cannot consider ourselves as having a free will at all. Because if an external mechanism says, okay, in these boundaries you have a free will, and then some Lesbian person's God machine intervenes, then it discovers to develop a morally inappropriate thought, and then it intervenes, and this thought is deleted. The freedom of thought actually already encroached upon. So it's in fact an attack also on the freedom to think. Moreover, as soon as an external mechanism deprives us of our free will to a certain extent, we will be divested of the very foundation of moral behavior and hence become only partially responsible for what we decide to do. Because we have, if we say, okay, we have a free will, as pessimists of Alaska would love to say, we have a free will to a certain extent, but then our responsibility, our accountability is also limited. Which this accountability is limited in relation to the world around us, but in relation to what we think, it should not be limited. And even if a free will as a threshold concept is an illusion, it is still an illusion that deserves appreciation, as freedom of the will is a central building block of human identity. Proven by various findings that show that belief in a free will and morally responsible behavior are related to each other. I cite here some words that, for instance, let me be entirely precise. Baumeister and others say that trust in free will has behavioral consequences, including increases in social and culturally desirable acts. Rigoni and his companions show that the readiness potential for acting is lower in individuals induced to be skeptical about the free will. In another article, Rigoni and colleagues demonstrate that undermining free will can degrade self-control and leads to other antisocial tendencies. Vos and Scholar provide evidence that mistrust in free will increases the tendency to cheat. So these findings have been criticized, but there are still findings that show that even if the free will as a threshold concept is an illusion, if it is a scalar concept, even in that case, we would probably act more morally if we believed that we had a fully free will. Then, additional reasons against compulsory moral bioenhancement. To be correct, Pessimists of the left used to claim that moral bioenhancement ought to be made obligatory. But then they retracted a bit from this stance, saying in their last, in their book, Unfit for the Future, well, actually not taking a stance on it, but the very fact that the people who are most in need of moral enhancement are probably precisely the ones who are least likely to decide to do that voluntarily. It is likely that it has to be imposed on them. And then you have all the trouble. So they ought to have a difficulty with retracting from the conception of obligatory, of compulsory moral enhancement, but if they say that it should be compulsory, then this whole set of problems appears. Plus, involving an external mechanism that adjudicates on what we are free to will opens up the question of who should be authorized to establish and run such a mechanism. So this God machine, who will run it? It's entirely, it's very difficult to imagine the existence of a morally adequate mechanism that already is in existence, and it is not in existence, unless we accept God as a morally adequate. But if we don't accept it, then this mechanism ought already to be in place to develop this God machine. Otherwise, the God machine is nothing else than a kind of police machine that whenever you think something that is no, then it intervenes and deletes this thought. And a program of also moral bioenhancement might be political repression because of what I just said. It's pretty clear. So, in conclusion, and I think I'm in line with 50 minutes, right? So, because Person and Weston said, okay, that I'm more concerned about freedom and they're more concerned with safety. In my opinion, as divesting humans of their free will, this possesses them of an essential component of their humanity, possibly inflicting the damage already ultimate harm. The goal to respect our free will by refraining from compulsory moral and bioenhancement is also aimed at safeguarding our human existence. So, my position is not only directed towards freedom, but also towards safety, because if we develop a mechanism that imposes an external mechanism that imposes limitations on our freedom what to will, then we already are in a way inflicting a sort of harm or ultimate harm on humans. So in what I propose, I'm also taking care of safety. What I do hope is that the next conference, whether that will be in 2 years or early or later, I don't know, the person at Savulescu will be present again, because here the discussions with them are extremely fruitful and for communities and stimulating. But because Savulescu is on sabbatical, I just returned from sabbatical, so he did not come this time, but it's in fact a debate that I think is still not over. What I do think, though, is that moral bioenhancement at this point is not something that should be taken too seriously. Okay, we have oxytocin, we have SSRIs, we have other beats, but generally we have optogenetics that can have an impact, but generally they're directed towards enhancing our empathy. But empathy is not enough for morality. Sometimes we do not have to be without any form of aggression when we see that someone who is an innocent person, say an innocent child, is being abused, and we turn our head around and who knows. But a certain form, I don't say physical aggression, but a certain form of aggression is needed to say to a moral stand that stop, this is not right. So, and the well-known example of judges who feel empathy towards the person who they should pass judgment on, and so on. So empathy is not necessarily, it's not the only element of morality. There is much more in morality than empathy. And to conclude, what gives, however, some reason for optimism, so that moral bioenhancement will become one day a very serious reality, is that there are regions in the brain that are discovered that are responsible for certain types of moral behavior. So I'm talking now about, in front of neurologists, about something that is not my field, but let me go even that far, so that orbitofrontal prefrontal cortex, empathy, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, utilitarian thinking more. So they're identified already. Transcranial magnetic stimulation and other means in the future might, and I think it's likely to have an impact on our moral behavior. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Thank you for the talk, Justin Collette from the University of California. So, I really like the talk, but I also like Sobolewski's view. Maybe you could say more about what you mean by free will. So just the ability to do otherwise seems to be a common conception of free will. And it seems as though whether we're enhanced or not, we still have that ability. So even if we understand it as a threshold concept, and the threshold concept is the ability to do otherwise, it seems as though we have that ability, even though we've been enhanced. So we're not forced to act morally. We could still watch TV instead of do the moral act. So why do you think that free will is affected necessarily under that conception if we still have that ability?
Okay, let me say something that might surprise you. I'm not even claiming to even have a free will. I'm even willing to accept that we don't, but that all this is rubbish. But not only what I said, but many other things are rubbish, so they're easy. But it's even possible the Libet experiments and other experiments that came afterward give some very interesting evidence or pointers to the non-existence of a free will, actually, that our decisions are being taken, allegedly decisions before we become aware of them. So I even accept that. So perhaps the free will is a metaphysical concept. Perhaps it's like a concept of the soul or the angel. So I'm even willing to accept that possibility. But under the condition that we accept that free will exists, then that all this debate makes sense, then what I said would flow from that, and then how you describe free will is an element of it. I agree with
that. Thanks very much for that. I think it was implicit in what you said, but you could go further. I think Persson and Sobolewski have Plato's problem, namely that the writer of the Republic would not have been tolerated by the Republic. And freedom is such an essential part of our conceptions of morality, certainly most parts of the civilized world, that Persson and Sobolewski would be the first to be silenced by the God machine, because it's quite clear that their views are inimical to any reasonable minimal threshold concept of morality. So I think they have silenced, by their advocacy of all of this, they've silenced themselves, and quite right to. The world is a better place for that, or would
Actually, I agree fully with that, but I focus my attention to the issue of free will. But if you take freedom, even in this sense, I agree that they're in trouble with that idea, and other trouble.
I'm not sure. I like the talk very much. I'm not sure whether you need to say that free will is not a matter of degree. It seems to me that all you need to say is that influences on our free will is unacceptable beyond a certain degree. Let me give one reason for thinking that, or one example for thinking that free will might be a matter of degree. For example, I get there's an external mechanism that is that my thinking for an hour from 11 p.m. to midnight every day. I think to that extent my free will is hampered. And one can also think that, in another day my free will gets disturbed for 2 hours and so on. It seems to me that at least in this example, our free will could be a matter of degree depending on the extent to which we are disturbed. So So that's my question. My question is that, I mean, to disagree with the two authors you mentioned, maybe you don't need to deny that free will must not be a matter of degree. All you need to deny is that our free will will not be interrupted beyond a certain degree, because beyond that degree, beyond unacceptable.
Indeed, you can. I could defend my position against it in that way as well, but I went further than that. Yeah.
Yeah, parents from one of the Belgian high schools. Can we say that cognitive engagement should be permitted only if it leads to its moral engagement? Only if there is clear possibility for moral engagement?
I wouldn't say so. We have various possibilities to cognitively enhance ourselves, either by biomedicine or by traditional means education that are morally neutral. And I don't see anything wrong with that. On the contrary, I favor it very much. If it is moral, it's great, but it's not necessary.
Okay, thank you. I will be Dr. Amy Rijeka still. Okay, so regarding the question of free will coming in degree, I will try to contribute to make sense of the idea of free will coming in degree. So let's think about the possibility of rendering impossible some behaviors, but not some other behaviors. So, for example, rendering impossible the possibility to kill innocent people, but not rendering impossible the capacity to cheat, to lie, to manipulate, to help people in need, and so on. This maybe could be a possible image of what we might speak about when speaking about free will coming in degree. And moreover, I'm suspicious that this is more or less our situation at the moment. Because my suspicion is that most of us in this room might be able to lie, to cheat, to manipulate, not to help people in need, but I also have suspicion that no one in this room would be able to kill an innocent person. So it seems to me maybe to strengthen free will that still comes in degree, and that I don't see that it's such a catastrophe for the moral personality to render impossible some kinds of extreme behaviors, like killing innocent people.
Yes, well, we come then in the direction of what I think Mike Hauskeller is going to say, but he should say this, but just to build upon that, is that if this conception is accepted, or a particular kind of my conception is accepted, then sometimes the bad would be better than the good. But we can even go further than that. We can say, for instance, that if take a kleptomaniac, and the state, the God machine intervenes, and it even expands his freedom because he is compulsed. He's a compulsory kleptomaniac. He's compulsed to steal. Now, an external mechanism can give him more options. So, to broaden his freedom or free will, if we accept the existence of free will. But it is still, even in that case, I think that is a quite detrimental, or that is a strong argument against what I'm saying, but or the strongest I can think of. But even then, it is an external mechanism that imposes something on you. And then we come with the question: who will run it? How to establish it? Will it lead to political repression? Why to assume that those who run such a mechanism will only run it for the benefit of morality? Well, like in the kleptomaniacs example.
It seems like
we have loads of questions and no time whatsoever. Unfortunately, I suggest we leave that for the lunch discussion and give you thank you. Applause out of our own
Actually, the questions should come after both. Okay, this time we won't do that, but actually first we have the presentations and then the questions at the end. I didn't say that at the beginning, sorry for that, but otherwise we might have lost track of the time.
Right. Hello, everyone. I'm also going to talk about moral enhancement and freedom, but I think I'm going to approach it from a slightly different angle. Recognize this image, this character. It's Malcolm McDowell in his role as Alex in Stanley Kubrick's film version of The Clockwork Orange. I think it was in 1972 that the film came out. 1961 that Anthony Burgess published a novel on which the film was based. Now, the novel and the film tell the story of this juvenile delinquent or young thug who likes nothing better but go with his pals out at night and do all sorts of mischief, including raping people and beating them up and lots of other damage to society. So, in other words, he's not a very nice person. And eventually he's being caught and incarcerated. And after a while in prison, it was suggested to him that he might undergo a certain therapy that makes him, that turns him into a good citizen. We are going to make you good at it. Right? And if you submit to this therapy, then you can leave prison, you can be free. So Alex says, okay, let's do it. And he's subjected to an aversion therapy. He's been tied to a chair and held in a particular position, looking to the front. His eyelashes are tied, are taped to his forehead so that he can't close his eyes. And then he's forced to watch violent movies all day long for several weeks. And at the same time, he's being injected with a drug that causes nausea, so that after a while this feeling of nausea is associated with violence. And after 3 weeks he is cured, he can leave the prison, and whenever he contemplates doing something violent, right, he gets violently sick instead and can't do it. He's being released as cured. Right? So what I want to propose to you here is that is an example of successful moral enhancement. Now you might say, well, that's not really moral enhancement. First of all, he wasn't really more moral in his attitude. He actually wanted to be violent, but he couldn't anymore, right? But from the standpoint of the purpose that was to be achieved here, namely, get rid of all that crime, get rid of the violence, it was successful. So it was goal-oriented, a certain behavior that was to be prevented, and in that respect, it was successful moral enhancement. Now, what I want to propose to you is that what is being discussed today as moral bioenhancement by its foremost proponents, namely Ingmar Carlsson and Judith Silvestri, is very much like that. It is goal-oriented. It's not about moral enhancement at all. It is about changing people's behavior. They deny that, right? When you try to accuse them of doing that, they say, well, that's not what it's all about, right? It's about changing people's motivations and making them more inclined to do good, to be just and altruistic and so on. But if you look at the rationale for the whole project of moral enhancement, it's all about changing people's behavior. Because if it were not about changing people's behavior, the whole project wouldn't make any sense. What they say is, we need to prevent ultimate harm. The apocalypse is nigh, right? If we're not going to do anything about it, we are going to die, all of us. Human civilization will come to an end. And the only way we can prevent that is through more violence. That's what we have to do. So it's all about changing people's behavior in order to save us from the end. It's not about morality. It's not about making people kinder. It's not about making people more autonomous or more prone to critical thinking or whatever. And all these things might be considered as aspects of what we consider to be moral behavior or moral thinking or moral attitude. It's all completely irrelevant. Morality is not an end in itself. It's a means to accomplish a certain state of affairs. And that means that Savulescu and Carson have to accept, and they do accept that, if we can make people good in the sense that they are incapable of doing anything that might threaten our survival as a species, threaten the survival of the planet, threaten the survival of human civilization. If that were possible, then we would have to accept it and do it. It might not be possible. Too bad, then we can't do it. But if it were possible, if it were to become possible, we would have to do it in order to accomplish that. Now there's a problem here where you say, well, going back to that novel, Clockwork Orange, there's a prison chaplain who's very unhappy about that proposal of changing Alex into something that he is not, into changing his character in such a way that he is incapable of doing anything wrong. And he says something like that violates what it means to be a human. It changes Alex, this person, into something else. It undermines his humanity. Right? And he also brings it in connection with the concept of free choice, right? We're taking the free choice away from him, and that's why it's bad. But that poses a problem, it poses a paradox, doesn't it? How can it be better for there to be people who freely choose evil, than for there to be only good people? But that's a paradox. But we would have to accept something like that in order to make sense of the proposition that if we can make everyone good, that is bad, right? If they are not free. So free choice is more important than everyone being good, that is everyone doing what we want them to do. So, the question is, and I call this Little Alex problem in honor of this character who's being called by his friends Little Alex. How can the bad ever be better than the good? How can the undesirable ever be desirable? Or at least the ability to do the undesirable, how can that ability be desirable? It seems to be a paradox. The answer given in the book by Burgess is, well, when it comes to the loss of humanity. But what exactly does it mean, a loss of humanity? Well, what is being suggested here is a certain normative hierarchy of possible worlds. The best world, the ideal world, would be a world in which everyone is good, and everyone is good by choice. Right? We decide for the good, and everyone does it. That is the best possible world. The second world is the one in which some people are good, some people are bad, but all have chosen to be what they are. That is actually the world in which we live. The third best world would be one in which everyone has a choice, but unfortunately we all choose to be bad. But that is still better than a world in which everyone is good, but without having chosen to be so. So the question is, does that make sense? Is it really better to have a world in which everyone is bad by choice than to have a world in which everyone is good, but not by choice? So how do we rank freedom of choice and, well, compliant behavior? Compliant in the sense of behavior that is the way we expect it to be or want it to be. Of course, if you don't agree with the whole proposition that freedom of choice is important, then you would have a different hierarchy. You would, for instance, say, well, these go first. All are good without having chosen to be so. Well, sorry, This one would be the best world, this one would be the second best, this one the third best, this one the fourth best, and so on. Right? So it depends on how we rank freedom of choice and goodness of behavior. Now, John Harris has first brought up the objection against Savulescu and Carlson based on the need for freedom. The importance has emphasized the importance of freedom. Evoking Milton's passage from Milton, where God talks to man and tells him, well, you have been created sufficiently stable and free to fall. So there's this basic freedom which allows you to be good, but also allows you to be bad. And then Harris comes, without the freedom to fall, good cannot be a choice, and freedom disappears, and with it is virtue. There's no virtue in doing what we must. In another paper he says, we can no longer be held responsible without that freedom of choice. Now this is, I don't think that objection or the way it is being argued why freedom of choice is important is sufficient. Because virtue, the value of virtue is not as obvious as one might think. So why should there be virtuous people? Virtuous in the sense of having made a choice for this, right? This might make sense in a Kantian framework, perhaps, but even there we could ask, well, in order to be praiseworthy, right, you would have to make a choice. But perhaps we're not talking about being praiseworthy, we're talking about just doing the right thing. And why should being praiseworthy something that we need to retain? In the same with being responsible. Yes, if you are responsible for what you do, then of course we should be able to hold people responsible. But if you're not responsible, why should we want to hold anyone responsible? Within a theological framework, that would make much more sense. And you know that the traditional defense of God in the face of all the evil in the world caused by humans is, right, he couldn't have prevented that without taking free will away from us. Right? But here it makes sense because, well, he's testing us, God. There's a task here, and we need to prove ourselves. So if there's a God, then from this perspective it makes sense. If there's no God, there's no one there who tests us, whom we have to prove ourselves to, then virtue, being held responsible, is not really important. Now Peter Singer has, so the question, why freedom, why is it important, is similar to the theodicy question, why did God permit moral evil? And in response to that, Peter Singer has written, ethically this argument is dubious because it implies that the value of free will is so great that it outweighs all the atrocities that humans have committed. So various stuff that humans have committed, so much evil in the world, right? Do we really want to say freedom is more important than that? Again, how do we weigh these two values if they're both values? So, in other words, the response is also given by Carlson and Savulescu and David Grazier and others. Well, freedom might be a value, but it's just one value among others. So, in order to uphold the claim that making people good, if you can do that, is wrong because it destroys human freedom, we would have to say, we would have to argue that freedom is not just one value among others, we would have to say it's a foundational value. But there are problems with that, of course. First of all, I don't think a good person is characterized by the ability to do evil and then deciding against it. That's not what a good person is. A good person is someone who's not able to do evil. Second problem, what freedom we will have will not be diminished to a more violent, say, Savulescu and Carlson. We are not going to be turned into mindless robots. Immoral actions will not be physically impossible, but only psychologically or motivational. The interesting thing is here, the only psychological or motivational. It's interesting because that is exactly the problem. It goes further than just preventing us from doing what we want to do, that would be physically impossible. It goes into the very heart of what we are. Now, as long as we are psychologically or motivationally incapable of doing something without someone else having determined our inability or caused our inability. This is a question of identity. This is what makes us what we are, this inability. But when someone else, another agent, enters the equation, right? When we are being engineered to be good, then our freedom is compromised. So it's not about freedom of the will. We don't even have to talk about the metaphysics of the freedom of the will. It's about this other agent which turns our identity around and makes what we are his or her decision. That is, we are turned into things, into tools to do someone else's will and bidding. And that is the problem. 30 seconds. The last point, I think it undermines the very purpose, the very idea of morality. Now, though I'm not a Kantian, I think that what constitutes the essence or an important, essential aspect of morality is not to treat others as mere means, but always as ends. But here, what is being proposed is that we actually turn people into means for the end of morality. And the question is, if people really are nothing but means to the end of morality, why the hell should we treat them as ends? So morality has no point. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Lovely presentation. Thank you. I think what you said is not inconsistent with the position.
Sorry, with your position?
With the position that I hold. But just to clarify why, the statement all are good in your table is not equivalent to no one acts badly. The claim that all are good is not the same claim as the claim that no one acts badly.
Well, I meant it to be the same claim.
They can't be the same claim. Well, this is simply like a good old conceptual analysis point. But what constitutes being good is not the same thing as no one acting badly.
What depends on your definition of what being good means. My point is that for Platon and Savulescu, this is the same, right? When they talk about moral bias, they mean no one acts badly.
It is for that,
right?
for them.
That's all I'm saying.
Fine, but for me, of course, it isn't. And I like your point at the end, we become means for the end of morality. But I would make that claim stronger, that in that person in Savulescu sense, it's not only that we would become means to the end of morality, we would no longer have a conception of morality. We would no longer have a conception of morality. So it's not just that we become means for its end, it's that as agents, we are no longer distinguished. And that means we don't have morality at all. And that's the basis of my criticism.
Yeah, well, I agree with that.
Excellent talk. I really enjoyed it. I'd like to push a little bit with regards to freedom as fundamental to morality. Helen Stewart has a nice view, she calls it agency and compatibilism. So you made a claim that you said a good person is one who cannot do that. But we wouldn't even have persons if it wasn't for a fundamental free will. So the whole concept of agency, we think is fundamental to personhood. But yet, if agency itself requires that we have an ability to do otherwise, then it seems that you couldn't even make the claim that a good person is one who cannot do that, because you couldn't even have good persons, because we wouldn't have the ability to be a person. So think about it like there are doings and then there's happenings, is the way that Helen talks about it. There would be no more doings if we didn't have history, because everything would be a happening of the past. Which is kind of
Well, you could also say if you had free will, really free will, then there would only be happenings and not doings. Because it's just then happening. But that's a problem with metaphysics of free will. Right?
Right, but I'm trying to speak to the primacy of how we kind of get morality off the ground. And I think that we get it off the ground because there's a fundamental difference between me and the chair, in the sense that I can do stuff and the chair can't.
Yes, we need to understand, we need to be able to understand ourselves as all agents. And free will is a
Yes.
constitutive element of that understanding. I agree. It's a necessary fiction.
I also enjoyed lots of the talk. I actually enjoyed the courage to make this categorization of the different worlds. And I especially caught my attention the last one is everybody's bad and even didn't choose it. That's capitalism. That's St. Augustine. It's capitalism. It's like everybody is a sinner and we didn't even choose it because it was aliens
Yes.
did that before us. But now how to do it, how to handle it. So it's interesting because even though it seems like the less free, it's actually how then there's a kind of a whole philosophy possible in order to get free. So even though this might be interesting as a starting point, it is still a stationary and still static in the sense that between these worlds are a lot of the dynamics, how to reach from the down part to the up part and back in the middle part and down. So I think it's important not to categorize like that in the sense of it's static, but actually what we need is like dynamics between all these positions.
Yeah, you're right.
Yes, so as everybody knows, Immanuel Kant wrote that categorical imperatives are such for us and not for angels, because they don't have these instincts that push them to be bad, so there are no need of categorical imperatives for them to restrict. So let's imagine a slightly stronger picture of the angels, that it's not only they don't have instincts to be bad, but they simply are unable to be bad. So that would be exactly the picture of the morally enhanced people. And in some sense, it would not be only that categorical imperatives are not needed for them, but even morality is not needed for them. But then my question is really this a worse society than our society? So for what reason it is worse?
Sorry, which society is worse?
The angels society. Yeah. According to your final point of your paper, that would have to be a worse society than our society. But doesn't seem to me so intuitive that it's really so.
I tried to discuss this point when I talked about the good person not really having a choice to be evil. That's not what a good person is. That would be the Kantian model, right? I have all these bad inclinations, or possibly I don't. They're irrelevant, but I'm making a choice. No matter what I'm able to do, I'm choosing the good, and that makes me a good person, right? But usually a good person is someone who never even thinks about raping and killing other people, right? It's not that I constantly think about that, I really would like to do it. And I say, no, it's important, I'm not doing it, right? I mean, there might be people like that, but we wouldn't say that these are the best people around, right? There would be rapists that decide for the sake of morality not to go around and rape people, right? It's people who never even have the idea, so they're incapable of doing it, right? And so this is the angel, right, who doesn't have to decide to do it, it's just incapable. But the thing is here, that would not be the fourth best world, because it is a choice, because it is their identity. But the thing is, with the morally enhanced person is that their identity is compromised because there's another agent that has made them be that way. And I think that makes all the difference. That I am what I am, incapable of evil, because I have grown that way. I just happen to be that way, or if I'm that way because someone has decided you have to be that way and implanted their idea of what is right and wrong, desirable and undesirable onto me, into my head, into my heart. That is the problem.
Alexander.
Thank you for the presentation. I share your idea that it's important to treat people as ends as human beings, but I think when we hear about the value of freedom to do wrong, but I think I might see with personalism this when it comes to the freedom to do evil. So I was just wondering, the fact that maybe it's overrated. And then I'm going to include maybe yet an argument based on the premise you mentioned. So, are we really treating people as ends if we ensure that everyone has the freedom to do evil, knowing that some will exercise it? Are we really treating future victims as ends if we fail to, say, wipe out the freedom to do evil, Eichmann's freedom, or the freedom of people of this kind, if we're willing to pay this price and impose this burden on future victims?
Sorry, I'm not entirely sure whether I understood your question, but
If it seems we want to preserve the full freedom, including freedom to do evil, Eichmann's freedom, Eichmann's.
yes, but you said if you want to ensure that, or by ensuring that. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we should ensure that people are still capable of doing evil. No, what I'm saying is the opposite. We should not try to ensure that they're incapable of doing it. I think there's a difference here. So it's not the evil that is important. It's the not being made subject to what I think is right and wrong, good and evil.
So we kind of running out of time, but several people want to
Actually, it seems that Nick Ager has not succeeded to get on Skype. Am I right?
Which saves
Which gives us plenty of time.
So in that case, it's actually your turn and then your turn. Okay.
And that's what I do.
In that case,
Join me and then we'll have a discussion.
No, well, actually, then what we can conclude after all this is that the only acceptable form of moral enhancement is voluntary moral enhancement. Moral enhancement is voluntary.
I'm not
Because
entirely sure.
then we're in line with your with the departure of this agonistic framework. We accept all voluntary moral enhancement. I'm kidding, of course, a bit, but is that, I mean, because none of those arguments which you give, and which I agree with very much, by the way, affects voluntary forms, not moral enhancement.
I'm not entirely sure. I thought about that. But I think one could argue that in that case I would enslave myself. I would deprive myself of the freedom that I should continue to have, to continue to be a moral agent. That is, I rob myself of moral agency. It's like someone, if I make a contract with you to become your slave, right? Then if you execute the contract in a way slave, then you can say, well, you did it voluntarily, right? So nothing wrong with it. But perhaps we would say, well, it's still wrong to enter such a contract, to deprive yourself of that freedom to go away. And that's it, it's the same with moral violence, right? I have that idea now as a present agent. I'm saying, I want to be that kind of person, and I want to be incapable of being anyone else. And now I have the means. It's a bit like Odysseus and the Sirens, right? But it's permanent. Odysseus gets released after a while, after the danger is over.
Why should it
But
be
the
permanent?
morally enhanced, yes, you are there for good, right?
Perhaps, why should it be permanent? You take a medication more enhancing, and then you decide it yourself, and you say, I will not take it anymore.
Well, why would you then
So
want
you
to
have
go
to
back? If you're then that different kind of person, nobody wants to be that way. And I'm just saying, this is not a definitive argument. I'm not saying this is the case, it's wrong, or it's exactly. I'm just reflecting on the issue of what freedom can mean in this context and why it might be important, right? And I'm just saying here, well, perhaps it's not as simple voluntary enhancement. There might be a problem with that.
No, it's not simple at all. Yeah.
Voluntary moral enhancement. Other forms of enhancement might be more unproblematic, right? But moral enhancement is a special case because it changes what you are, your identity.
And it should, yeah.
So I am struck how much you guys are thinking about the case of a government of the country, Julian and Harrison. You mentioned the of government forcing people to be morally enhanced. For all the reasons that Vojin and Michael, that wonderful John said, I wholly agree that project doesn't make sense to me. That said, I am wondering about the pressure that's being put on the voluntary, involuntary distinction. Again, when it comes to children, according to Aristotle, we force people to become good. People are forced by their habituation to be the sort of person who makes good choices. So if that's...
No, we don't force children.
Well, I was actually quoting Rousseau uses the phrase force our children to be free. But Aristotle, I mean, who cares about who said it, but there is a point, I think, in it. There is some truth, I think, in the claim that we do. We shape our children, we force them to become...
Shape, okay, force not.
So as you well know, I mean, I think it's important to try to operate shaping and accepting, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say here is, well, of course, I object altogether to the kinds of forcing and shaping that are being described by some people. I wonder if it's important for us to recognize the way in which some forms of shaping in some contexts with some means are actually quite important, in particular in the context of parenting. And I'm just wondering out loud about just voluntary. Again, this is back to a question that was asked earlier about which context are we talking about? Moral enhancement in what age group, which sphere of the world? And it's just I'm thinking about it. It's fascinating to be forced to think about this context of parenting.
I would say it's the Habermasian concern with which I would respond here, namely that we need to take care that the other remains a partner in the discourse, in the conversation that we have. And that is what education ideally should be. It might not always be, right? But there is certainly a kind of education where I try to implant certain ideas into my children, right? And enforce this. But that's not how we would normally think ideal education should work, right? It's more an exchange of ideas, of trying to guide, but accepting what is coming back and dealing with that, and so on. So it's a conversation. Conversation.
And of course, and the question is to what extent do parents actually, to make children able to engage in kind of democratic deliberation that Habermas did, to what extent does parenting require some degree of shaping? And I think more about this forcing shaping difference, but I wonder if we're exaggerating this, if we're overdrawing the voluntary, involuntary.
I think what is interesting in this, exactly in this way, is exactly the context. For example, the context of education is a good example, exactly to say, in a certain way, maybe it's not forcing, but then there's societies that actually say until you're 18 or until you're 16 you have to go to school. And if you don't go, there might be the police having problems with your parents, and even your parents are going to have problems with being your parents because they don't force you in the end to go to school. Interesting, I think, in this idea of getting away from the idea of forcing is, for example, Peter Sloterdijk's book, You Must Change Your Life, where he also says it's not just about us permanently having to improve ourselves, if it's morally, if it's bodily, etc. But it's also later in life, not as school children, but later in life, it's also us consciously choosing our teachers that teach us, or that basically where we submit ourselves to a process of enhancement, but it comes from not from ourselves, but it's a relation of the teacher. Exactly, relationship. Yeah, I'm just saying it's not just about the activity or the activeness, but it's not just about active and passive. It's also that in the moment where the social relations and social relations make part of enhancement, we're never just in charge, we're never just the one who enhances. there's also kind of a relation.
John, and then you.
Two quick points. First, I think Henry was addressed your point about sacrificing the future generations who may be damaged by the evil choices. And it's important to address that because, in my view, we're protecting them precisely because we are preserving their free will. So I guess they may be damaged by the operations of a maniac who exercises that, but we're enabling them to have that. So, as it were, they are the objects of our concern, and it's a question of whether or not that concern is discharged best by preserving free will for future generations, or in the God machine where we're not preserving. And just a quick point on the kids. We have to remember that we're not dealing with kids here.
Sorry, we're not.
We're not dealing with kids. I mean, of course, the education of children, it always goes through the stage of the mother who says to her daughter, go and see what your little brother is doing and tell him to stop. That's part of education. Or as Wittgenstein said, you can't start by teaching children this is possibly a chair. You have to start by teaching them certainly this is a chair. Then afterwards you can get to this is possibly a chair. So I just think the education of children is
But it usually doesn't stop there, does it? Go tell your brother to stop, and the system might ask why. Right? And then you could say, because I say so, but that's...
Well, you say that's a shorthand, but it doesn't
If you're
matter.
Bayesian, you might say that.
The point is, it doesn't matter energy that you say because I say so in that education. But on the hypothesis that they're not at the age of discretion, at the age of autonomous.
Okay.
And the age of discretion is just a phrasing whether they're autonomous. There's no age of discretion. So forget children. Okay. They'll survive.
Still talking about expression, something like this. My first impression is that you presented this problem as if the moral bioenhancer would turn off or turn on our free will. And this, and your framework of different possible worlds, it means to me that it's like this: all people are turned on or turned off, and some are not. Or my question is, if your reasoning is still what you will say, if the moral bioenhancement only increase the likelihood to acting by good reasons. If this is, and I think if there is a possibility, this is the only possibility, even if we accept your view on freedom and free will. And so the point is, if we have reasons to constrain people less or strongly, for example, if we can only nudge them, like in the paternalist discussions, we can create circumstances that people will reason better than not. Or we force them like the cattle, for example, or we constrain. And so my point is that if, for example, your view is still stand if we are talking about this kind of drug, moral bioenhancement that enhance the likelihood of acting by good reasons. And if this is true, if we couldn't have reasons, if we haven't have reasons for constrain people like immunization, compulsory immunization, or to take the pill, for example, I think you will say it's wrong to force people to take the pill, but not necessarily that to offer the possibility of taking a drug that increase the likelihood.
I think my point was that that is useless in the context of what those who propose this, of Western philosophy, are trying to achieve. Ultimate harm to prevent ultimate harm. Right? is at stake. So all I'm saying is the logic of this argument compels us to accept that if forcing people to be good, whatever that means, to act in the way that we want them to act, then we have to do it. Right? Whether it's possible to do that, and perhaps if it's not possible, then we can still give it a try and nudge them, as we say, in the right direction. That might not help, might not be sufficient, and the apocalypse will come anyway, but perhaps it might, perhaps it is sufficient. So it might be worth giving it a try. But that is not, there are other problems with that, namely, what is the right way to act and think, right? Is the analysis of cause and result really really plausible? Is the reason why we continue destroying the environment? Is it a lack of certain moral features that we have, right? Or is it perhaps rather a lack of prudence, right? Usually it's not, the argument is not to protect the environment. There are other people who need that environment, right? Usually the argument is you're destroying the branch on which you're sitting, right? You're destroying your own world. So the appeal is to prudence rather than humanity. And with terrorists, it's even more blatantly obvious and more enhanced in the sense of making people act more in accordance with what they think is just would help much with that problem, right? Because terrorists usually do what they think is just. And the problem is not that they are not moral enough. The problem is that they're too bloody moral. Right? The problem is
No, I took you very well. Okay. Lauren Bunch, coming from Duke University. I guess for both speakers, I am wanting to at least question this assumption that moral bioenhancement, even if it is done via compulsory means, would automatically result in a decrease in free will. What I have in mind here is, I think you're both viewing it as someone uses this enhancement and then behaving immorally is no longer available to them. But it seems like you could also conceive of it as now all these morally permissible ways of acting that are available to them and are possible for them to engage in. So I guess in some ways it seems like an empirical question about knowing how exactly these enhancements would function. But I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that. Why is it that the compulsory bioenhancement would automatically lead to a reduction in free will and not a maintenance of free will or perhaps even an enhancement of one's free will capability?
Because there's no evidence for the addition. You're losing something, but there's no evidence that you're gaining any extra choices of a different sort.
Anything? Anything else?
The choices become more limited, but there are exceptions. The kleptomaniacs example but that are weird examples. There, if we talk about the general population, it's obvious, I think, that if an external mechanism imposes limitations on the free will, that the freedoms of choice are limited, and that's also the questions of the Leslie say when they discuss the God machine.
But isn't that assuming free will is limited by using the intervention? It seems like there you were already assuming that free will was being limited when the intervention was imposed, and that assumption is what I'm wondering about.
Can they still do it or not?
What's that?
Can they still do it or not? If they can't,
but now maybe they can do things they couldn't do before.
They leave the possibility of the persons of the West to withdraw from being connected to the God machine. So they leave this possibility open. But then,
I'm not, sorry, I'm a bit confused. I'm not entirely sure whether I understand your objection. But it seems to me that if you don't do certain things, right, because it's just not you, right, you're a person who protects the environment, who never throws stuff just away, but separates everything, and so on. That's the kind of person you are. Fine, you're free, right? Because that's your choice. But if you're not that kind of person, right? And I come along and say, oh, this person really does stuff that is bad for the environment. And I want to change that. So I give you a pill so that you become someone who always separates and stuff and never does anything like destructive for the environment and so on. Then you're no longer free. Even though from your subjective internal point of view nothing might have changed, right? You're a person, nothing might be different from if you had that outlook right from the start, right? You're still someone who wants to protect the environment and so on. But the difference is I have determined that you should be that kind of person when I have made you that way.
And in addition to that, even if you have the freedom to disconnect from the God machine, how will you realize the freedom? You're already under the control of the God machine. So you're already in. So it is just a freedom on paper almost, that you're free to disconnect from the God machine. But I'm afraid we're on lunchtime now. Actually, 2 minutes. We're already 2 minutes in lunchtime.
And the last in the zone,